Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to Finding Me in the ITV network. It's a surreal scenario, a surreal environment in space, and I think a very surreal time. But as usual, the conversation needs to happen so that despite our circumstances, we're continuously learning and growing, and hopefully we come out all the better. So with me today, I have Siseko Khumalo, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria, and we're touching on a very important concept, that of femicide, violence and state violence, which is everything that it can be conceptualized in this particular crisis time of the pandemic of COVID-19, and again our reflections in a post-COVID-19 scenario. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, Siseko, for making this time. As you said, it's your first encounter outside since the start of the pandemic.
Yes. Thank you very much, Quraysha, and thank you for having me. You're quite right. It's the first time that I've sort of gone out of the public's or out of my sort of private residence since COVID-19, and the lockdown has happened. And on the one hand, you know, there seems to be a buzz of a seminal normality in the world. On the other hand, there also seems to be a sense of very, as you say, it's a surreal moment in time. It's a very surreal kind of experience, where we are thinking about what the world will look like after this pandemic, what the world will look like after the lockdown in the country, in many respects. Yes, it's a very, very strange time indeed.
But I think our responsibility as academics is to not only think or imagine the possibility of the future and the way it's going to look, but also to start contributing towards an awareness and a consciousness, so that we actively start changing the way in which we imagine the present and start imagining the future. And so it's not only just about sitting and writing from your ivory tower or from your little location or your space, but imagining a new way in which you as an individual who has the potential to impact can start impacting. Have you thought about this?
Absolutely. And this is part of the work that we're doing, as you said, for the femicide conversations, whereby we are hosting a series of webinars as the politics department at the University of Pretoria, in conjunction with the Javid UP Arts Centre. And in many respects, we are thinking precisely about that, right? So we've seen scholarship as activism in many respects, historically in the South African context and further afield. But we're saying, okay, beyond just the activism of writing, because in many instances as well, a lot of the work that we develop tends to be paywalled by these massive journals, and people can't get access to that. How do we democratize the knowledge-making project? But more than democratizing the knowledge-making project, how does the knowledge project feed into global struggles, into South African local struggles, and specifically into the lived realities and the struggles of women in our country? How do we make sure that we as a university are responsive to our institutional locale, which is the immediate surroundings within the Pretoria context, which is in the immediate surrounding of the national context in South Africa? How does the University of Pretoria actively take a step in making sure that we raise awareness, but also that we change policy, that we influence policy, that we influence what is being thought about nationally in this country with respect to women and women's lives, and what and the violence that women have had to endure in South Africa and even internationally. Yes.
So when you speak about femicide, just for the benefit of my audience who are not so familiar with all the big terms that many academics use, can you just explain to them, what are you talking about?
So when we're talking about femicide, we're talking about, and of course this is a very contested concept, and that was actually the reasoning behind us having the conversation. Femicide, in popular discourse in any case, means a woman who dies at the hands of a man violently, right? So this can either be through murder, this can be through rape, this can be through a series of acts of violence, right, where a woman is murdered or ends up in many instances dead as a result of violent masculinities in the country. And we've seen this, of course, going back in this country quite a number of years. And this is what motivated me specifically, right? So in 2018, we saw the case, no, it wasn't 2018, it was 2017. We saw the case with Karabo. In 2018, it was the case of Kensani Maseko. In 2019, it was the case of Uinene Mokgwetyana. And I thought to myself, you know, can we actually have a time or a year, 2020, where we don't have a black woman trending on social media in the news bulletins in this country because she's been murdered? violently murdered by a man in this country. Right. So for me, that was the sort of driving impetus to say, how do we begin to change the narrative, and how do we begin to make sure, when we say Black Lives Matter, for instance, how do we begin to make sure that all Black life matters, Black women's life matter, Black men's lives matter? How do we make sure that women are not mistreated, are not violently killed and murdered? And also the brutality with which this violence takes place, especially with the case of Karabo and Uinenemkhuyana, the violence is remarkable. It is absolutely remarkable. And for me, I think that's what we're trying to understand, right? So what does the popular discourse mean with respect to femicide? So it means a woman dying at the hands of a man. And how do we begin to change that narrative?
I think what many people also don't realize is that usually in this case, for example, the case of a rape, it's also related to power, right? So the person might not be affluent or wealthy or whatever, but there's a certain manifestation of power. And there might be, a problem in terms of the way in which this person has been socialized. From your conversations and the discussions that you've been having, what do you feel, or what have you seen in terms of, the profile of the oppressors and, of course, the profiles of the perpetrators?
Well, in many instances, this talks to work that I'm thinking about in terms of even my research, right? To say, if we think about the violence of colonialism and coloniality, how has it manifested and been internalized in our Black communities, right? And of course, we see this in that paper that Yvette Abrahams did all the way back in 2001, where she asks the question of, she uses the case of Sarki Baartman, for instance, in the Cape Colony. And she says, in many respects, white boys in the Cape Colony used to use slave girls, Black slave girls, as their initiation process, right, into manhood, right, violently raping young Black women. And that was their way of conquering and taming the wild, right? And subsequently after that, they would be regarded as men, right? And for me, that really points to a number of ways in which historically coloniality has framed Blackness in this country, and how it is that we have then imbibed those narratives around Blackness that have been produced by colonialism and coloniality in our South African context. And so what you begin to see, and in many respects, is that you have these violent masculinities modeled by whiteness through colonialism, apartheid, and systematic oppression ever since, 1652, for instance. Then you come back, or then you bring that all up, and you see the ways in which those violent masculinities of whiteness have been translated into Black communities, and how it is that Black men themselves, in many respects, because of the I suppose the ways in which whiteness has broken the Black family unit, how it is that many Black men don't grow up without a model, right, in terms of healthy masculinity, what it means for a man to relate to a woman, what it means for a man to coexist with a woman in society. And one of the questions, and I know it's a really pointy question, but one of the questions that I would like to put out to our viewers at home, as well as the general broader public in South Africa, how many of us young black men grew up with healthy masculinities being modeled in front of us, right? So with a father who related to their mother in good ways, because even, and this is, part of the work that I'm doing right now, even when black men were present in our black communities and not being violent, their presence was an absence in some form or the other, right? So it's either the father goes off and has another partner somewhere else and has another family in many respects, although he is home and he does come back home on certain days, right? If that's not the case, he's drinking and he acts out in violent ways towards the family, towards his wife, towards his children. If that's not the case, he's not at home completely, right? He's absolutely absent. So I wonder, again, how it is that we as young black men, if we have healthy masculinities that we can look up to and that we can model in our societies.
And that's a very challenging question, because if you look at the entire history of this country, it has always been, where families, like you said, were completely separated in the sense that men had to go out, migrant labor, to go and earn. They were impoverished. You had to be separated. You had to find a way of sustaining the family, but at the same time, again, other issues came up, and so this family circumstances became exacerbated. As you said, one family became two, or maybe one wife became two, and so the economic debt increases. At the same time, you're sitting in a situation where people are struggling to come out of poverty, socioeconomic circumstances, the inequalities have exacerbated, life has become more challenging, and people are struggling just to come out of that daily grind. But at the same time, they're dealing with issues related to violence. They're related to not only domestic violence or femicide, but also to economic violence. And so there's just so many odds stacked against the person that one has to question, how do we ever break from this particular mold and come out of this?
And I think that's a poignant and beautiful question, actually, because it suggests, if you would allow me, it suggests us at this particular point in time where the entire society has been completely, sort of pushed to the ground, right? So the crisis that we're facing right now has forced us to, in many respects, creatively and imaginatively rethink how we do economics in the world, how we do politics in the world, how we do education and knowledge dissemination in the world. The situation has really, really pressed upon us the demand to reimagine our worlds, right, out of the inequalities that we have seen. However, I fear that in many respects, with the whole chat around when do we get back to normal, when do things go back to the way that they were, it's that comes from the reality that nowadays, and whether we're talking about gender-based violence, whether we're talking about economic poverty, whether we're talking about socioeconomic inequality in the country, that talks to the fact that COVID-19 has really, really shown us the evil within our society, if I can call it that. It has starkly revealed it to us, and what the normal circumstances of society facilitated was an ambivalence and an ignorance, right? We could, in many respects, because I'm in the office from 8 to 5, and from there I go and I pick up the kids and I go home and I go cook, and I'm attending to my nuclear family. In many respects, and this is one of the reasons why, for instance, in the first week of the lockdown, we had nearly, 70,000, if not more, calls of gender-based violence, because the nuclear family was precisely that. The nuclear family was bound in that very unit. And a lot of the conversation that we were seeing in the broader public in South Africa was that, in many respects, the work environment was a way for a lot of women to be able to get away from their abuser, at least for 5 to 8 hours, right? So I think what we're seeing right now is, as you say, when do we ever get away from it? I think our governments globally were being given the opportunity of radically reimagining our worlds. Have they used that opportunity? I don't think so. I think they've squandered that opportunity because of the pressures of capital, of global capital. And again, who manages global capital? I will not say it, but I think all of us know. And those people want to serve. They want to go to their restaurants. These are the people who for them, the lockdown is an inconvenience more than anything.
Exactly that.
It's an inconvenience more than anything. And these are the people who don't necessarily see the struggles of the vast majority of our people in our country, who think about the idea of how do I put food on the table on a daily basis.
So we have to go to a break, but when we come back, I just want to touch on this whole concept of the nuclear family again and bring in the COVID situation to you again, but we'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of Finding Me in the ITV networks, today with my very special guest, Siseko Khumalo, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Pretoria, and we're speaking specifically about the issue of violence with regards to gender-based violence, femicide and state violence. But we'll come to the question of state violence a little later in the discussion. Siseko, before we went into the break, you were speaking about the fact that in a COVID-19 scenario, more men are spending time at home. And so the issue of gender-based violence has escalated. We see greater violence. Also, you touched on the concept of the nuclear family, right? And you said so you had these families, but the men went to work and the woman went to work and the children were cared for somewhere else, and then you'd come back and it was an opportunity for women to escape that violence. But that's very problematic for me, because the first question is then, what do you understand in terms of family? What does family mean to you? What is the nuclear family and what are family values? Because if having children or having a family or being married means that you must go away, I must go away, the children must go away, everybody else cares for different members of the family rather than us caring for ourselves, then is that family? It's you understand what I'm getting
Absolutely.
at? Yeah, because now with COVID-19, you're all at home.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be caring for each other. It should be a blessing to spend that time, because why have a family then if everybody else is doing something for the children, for the wife, for the husband, for your mental well-being? For me, my understanding of a marriage, of a family, is that you build each other up, not outside building you, or that you work together and you give to each other and you create that safe space, because
between the family, within the
family, because once the sanctity of the family is there, and the peace in the family is there, and the love in the family is there, and the goodness in the family is there, exactly as you spoke about, that role model, that all of that happens in the family. Everything that
comes
projects
out into society,
yes,
right?
and that's why the society is healthy, and the community is healthy, and then the world becomes healthy. But maybe we're so unhealthy and so diseased and so abnormal is because the problem has started right
at home.
Yes.
And I actually wanted to thank you for that observation, because it does point to the systematic and inherent problem of the ways in which even the family functions in our country. And this is not only a South African problem. I would suggest that this is a global problem, right? Whereby, as you say, the mom goes off at work and finds the work environment to be an escape, right? And finds the work environment to be an escape from the abuse of the home. The children go away to school and find that to be an escape from the toxicity that exists between mommy and daddy. Daddy is so stressed out because he can't make the bills, because of this, because of that, and the other thing. And it systematically, I think it points to the problem that, in a sense, the family unit is facing so many pressures, right? From so many aspects of society, that in many respects it becomes a dysfunctional unit.
Yeah.
A dysfunctional unit that then becomes dysfunctional of society, right? So society as a whole then in and of itself also becomes fundamentally dysfunctional, right? And I think that for me suggests, again, the years and years of injustice, oppression and domination, which is to suggest that we have our values, our very internal values, have been so eroded and so depleted that in many respects we are struggling with who we are as a people. In and of itself, we are struggling with finding out who we are.
Not only struggling in finding out who we are, but also in struggling in maintaining those kinds of relationships that were essential to our sense of community and understanding, isn't it? Because, we exist we should be existing within a healthy space where we contribute to goodness, but that goodness should come out from our interactions with each other. And of course, the first interaction is in the family unit. But now if there isn't that healthy interaction in the family unit, it's unhealthy, and you go out and you exacerbate that unhealthiness. We get this extended notion of violence in every single way. So it's not only subjective violence, it's emotional violence, it's psychological violence, psychosocial violence, and then eventually translates even into state violence, as we have seen now. But we'll come to the issue of state violence a little later. I just want to talk a little bit more about this issue of violence and femicide. And you were telling me a little bit from your research and some of the music and some of the literature, etc., that you have been researching, and then you found interesting conversations that happen through creative expression from Black women, from Black artists. Share a little bit with us.
So if we think about, for instance, to mind. In any case, there's the work of Busim Mhlongo that comes to mind, specifically that album of hers that she did in 1998, where she talks to the concept of the urban Zulu, right? And in there, there are two songs for me that are really, really useful, right? And the one talks to what is it? She talks to she's in many respects thinking about her relationship with her husband. And she asks this very pertinent question. She says, why am I not enough? Right? She says, "Webaba wabanta bam, kanti yini," right? So she's basically asking this question of, I've given you everything, right? I've given you children, I've given you a family, talking to this breakdown of the family unit and the family cohort. I've given you children, I've given you a family, I've given you a home. What more do you want from me? Right, and that came out as early as 1998, where she did that particular music. And it's so interesting because in many respects, right, a lot of the work that we're seeing, or a lot of the problems that we're seeing in contemporary society, have been addressed in many instances by Black artists, either in the music form or in actual artworks or in poetry and in literature. And I would suggest that a lot of the work in terms of our own responses nowadays needs to take seriously that work that was developed by those Black artists, in the sense of how do we draw from that to begin to respond to the contemporary socio-political issues. Then there's another song by Ledambulu, and this was a song that she did in 1978.
1978.
Yeah, 1978.
Okay.
And she asks the question. The song is titled Buza, right? And she says, and there's a beautiful refrain that says, Ngiyabuza, Ngiyabuza, abazali bayoyikani inzalo yabo. And what basically that translates to is, I am asking this question of what is it that parents fear of their own children, right? So in 1978, talking to this very problem as we're talking about the debilitation of the family unit, where the mother has to go away, the father has to go away, the children go away. In 1978, Ledambulu asks that question. She says, why are parents so afraid of their own children? And that was because of the ways in which children were behaving towards their own parents, whereby parents were now arrested, right? They were petrified of their own children. And we're seeing this contemporarily, even to this day, with the rise of drug abuse in our communities, with the rise of alcohol abuse in our communities, where it is the children that are raping grandmothers, mothers. It is the children that are robbing and stealing from their parents, right? I'm reminded of that short story by Alan Payton, right, where the man on the Friday afternoon, he's been paid and he's going home, and his own son is among the cohort that steals that pay from him, those wages from him. So it's very interesting how artists in our context have considered these questions as far back as 78.
And we're right at the end. We're going to come back with another interview, but I mean, I just want to close this very quickly in terms of worried about the behavior of children, but firstly it also points to a finger towards a failure in parenting. Right, so one, there's a failure of parenting. Two, the behavior of children, and you see the cruelness, the cruelty, shall I say, that children are manifesting towards other children. I mean, schools today are unhealthy environments where young boys are raping young girls in the toilets. And I mean, it's happening from primary school age, which is so scary, and abuse of alcohol. COVID-19 has exposed much of that also. But also, I want to come back to a very important question. And that question being is that when we as a family are together, do we have the potential to raise each other? To rear our children, now that you don't have the entertainment, you don't have the restaurants, you don't have the media, you don't have all of these things where you dump your children to raise your children. Now you have to raise your children. So COVID-19 has been a very important space to challenge the role of parents and about parenting. Don't you think so? And let's end on that thought.
Absolutely. And I think in many respects, for me, in any case, it all goes back to a very deep sense of self and self-knowledge and self-awareness. If we know our values, if we know our customs, if we know our traditions, and if we keep true to our traditions, as we were chatting before we came on live, you did mention that this is a situation that shows us that in the Islamic tradition, in fact, this crisis, this global pandemic, is taking us back to our Islamic traditions and to our values. If we rediscover those values, I do think we have the capacity to hold each other and to nurture each other, and for our values to come to be the fact that brings us back to each other.
And not only that, I think ultimately across all societies, if you look at the values, they're the same. People are the same, they have the same, goodness, the same heart, the same humanity, the same sharing, the same caring, compassion, empathy, but it's just been stripped, it's been eroded from us. We've lost touch of who we are and what is important to us, because we're so busy chasing a wantonness, an empty field. But we're coming back with another interview. I'm going to hold you here, and then we're going to go and talk a little bit about state violence and democracy. We'll see you next week. Fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.